It's been a great conference so far. I hope we stay up to that level. I'm sure my panelists will, and I'll be quiet mostly as a moderator, so that should be easy. The panel, you have it in your program. Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of the great state of Minnesota. Joanna Lyndgate, Director of States United Democracy Center, very active for the last, well, everyone on this panel has been very active for the last decade. A little more time than we hoped, I think, dealing with the threats of autocracy, and it's not going away, incidentally, whatever happens on November 5th, so it's, I'm afraid this is what history has given us, but I suppose we should rise to the occasion as much as we can. And my colleague, Sarah Longwell, who's been a huge leader, obviously, in many, many efforts, most of which I won't bother listing, a couple of which I'd be shot if I mentioned them, so I can't do that, you know, so I guess I shouldn't make shooting jokes. I take that back, that's off the record, I retract that. So we'll try to be quick, and we'll really be practical, I think, about the threats that the country faces, and not just that we have faced, but that we face now, and that we might face after the election as well. Because I think one theme that might come out of our discussion is that the threat of 2025 is different in some ways and more serious than the threat of 2017. But that's, I'll let the panelists speak to that. So let's begin with our elected official here on we always defer to the electeds, you know, here on us staff, us former staff, us staff guys up here. So Keith Ellison.
Yeah, thank you. And if I may just say, it's great to be here. This is a wonderful gathering because I look forward to us being able to go back and argue about regulation, taxes, and the proper role of government. We can have those debates, but the basics, rule of law, the freedom of the press, independent judiciary, we've got to agree on those things. And everybody here is 100% on that, so thank you.
You know, if I could just I'd interrupt for 12 seconds. I think you came to Congress in 2000.
2007 was when I started.
And so I was there in Washington, and we had a minor disagreement about one of the policy issues of the day, the Iraq War. And I think that's how we met, you know.
That's right,
so
that's right.
It would be good to go back, even that, which was a major disagreement. I don't mean to make light of it. It would be good to debate issues of foreign policy and domestic policy, as opposed to preserving constitutional democracy in America. So
absolutely, and it's good to see Charlie Dent, who is a true Republican conservative, but believes in the rule of law. So good to see you, man. So let me just get at it. So just to illustrate for you how things have changed, when President Trump was in his first term, Democratic AGs, often combining with 2 or 3 other Republican AGs, challenged President Trump maybe, I don't know, hundreds of times literally in court, and we won about 80% of the time because they didn't understand the Administrative Procedures Act. Now they do. And so I just think it's important to bear in mind, we're not looking at a replay. We're looking at something different, which is why I'm glad we're here to talk. I can tell you that from a rule of law standpoint, extremely concerned because of let's just start out with the election. And in terms of the elections and how elections are run, we had to sue the United States Postal Service because, President Trump's, designee was throttling the mails because he was afraid of absentee voting because of the pandemic, and as a result, was trying to make it harder for people to vote by mail. We had to sue. We won. I have a feeling they'll be prepared to do that. Also, going back to rule of law, we had a number of people, and this again is on this theme of elections as well, is that I actually had to sue several parties who were advertising that they wanted to hire armed guards to come to Minnesota to stand outside of polling places so that they could protect the vote. And so I told them, if you come here and do that, I absolutely am going to sue you. We will seek criminal charges as well. That's voter intimidation, and we were able to stop them from doing that. But you can imagine somebody standing around a polling place with a AR-15, that might present a problem for democracy, wouldn't you think? And so, and I'm thinking that given this culture of political violence that is starting to really take hold it's something that will have an even more prominent role in the days to come if we don't act as Americans to make sure that the vote is free, fair, unencumbered, and there's no intimidation. Let me move on and just talk about things like the what I would call the Muslim ban. I happen to be Muslim, and so when that particular piece of legislation came forward, I kind of took umbrage at that, and so but that piece of legislation was upheld by the Supreme Court, but only after several iterations where they had to water it down several times. But the Supreme Court has changed. So we just really don't know what if he did say, a particular religious group is going to somehow be banned and be barred from immigration. So there are a number of threats on the horizon. I can tell you that we've lost great people like Lawrence Wasden. I don't know if you all know Lawrence Wasden, but he was the Attorney General in Idaho. He was a super good guy, and when Ken Paxton in Texas got a bunch of conservative AGs to file a petition in the United States Supreme Court trying to stop elections in places like Pennsylvania, Lawrence Wasden said, I'm not going to be part of that. Well, they went after him and they got rid of him, and he lost. He's now gone to his reward. But the point is, the intimidation factor connected to conservatives with integrity is a real worry. Because think about just Georgia and how the Republican voting apparatus in Georgia said, no, actually, the other guy won, because we can count. 1, 2, 3 adds up to 1, 2, 3, and it's still 1, 2, 3. And yet, we know that they're now getting ready to try to put all of these cronies in place. So it is a new threat that we're facing. I can tell you that attorneys general are a part of this important fight. We will be at the disposal of the American people to stand up for rule of law, not for Democrats, not for Republicans. One of the things about being an attorney general is that you really should not do your job in a highly partisan way. You really should try to uphold the rule of law, make sure that elections are free and fair, and protect consumers. But the truth is that we're in conversation and we're trying to prepare for what we hope doesn't come. But as was said in the earlier panel, this movement isn't going to change in any case, which means this particular meeting is vitally important for the long term.
Thanks, Keith. That was terrific. Let's go to Joanna and then to Sarah and say a couple of words along what you've been involved in a lot of the same fights that Attorney General Ellison has. So tell us about that.
Yes. Well, first of all, huge thanks to our host today. I don't see Norm, but I want to give a special shout out to Norm, who has been raising the alarm on autocracy for as long as anyone, and to all of you for being here today. And also want to say, if I did have to go to Guantanamo, I actually feel like this would be a pretty good crew to go with, Sarah in particular, because she'd definitely keep us laughing, as you'll discover in a moment. So I'm going to try to cede as much of my time as possible to her. But so by way of background, Joanna Lyndgate, I run an organization called States United. We are a bipartisan group, and we provide direct support to the state officials in the battleground states who help run and protect and defend our elections and ultimately our democracy. So we do work with the fabulous state attorneys general, like A.G. Ellison. We do work with governors and also with secretaries of state. I previously served as the Chief Deputy Attorney General in Massachusetts, and in that capacity coordinated a lot of the state's collective litigation against the Trump administration during those 4 years, alongside some incredible champions. And we won 80% of those cases. We sued, I don't even know how many, hundreds of lawsuits ultimately between and among all the states, and we had a really high success rate. But as A.G. Ellison said, we're looking at a very different landscape right now. We could talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and all of the ways in which Project 2025 is just a much more sophisticated playbook. And also, as A.G. Ellison said, the courts have really changed. But I want to start with some good news, because I think that's really important for us to all try to focus on the things that at least get me out of bed every morning. So I'm just going to read you a few facts, things that we know, and then talk a little bit about what I think our states, that's my area of focus, our states and state officials can do to capitalize on these truths. Because right now, states are really on the front lines, state officials are on the front lines of protecting and defending our rights and freedoms in a way like never before, and not just when it comes to elections, but when it comes to so many of the issues that I think we collectively care about. Okay, so the good news. Americans actually believe in democracy, and they want free and fair elections. They don't know what the word democracy means. I'll talk about that in a minute. Like, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But 2/3 say democracy is the best form of government. 2/3 agree that political power should be split among different branches of government. 3/4 care about every vote being counted more than they care about their preferred candidate winning. 69% believe their votes will be counted accurately in this election. And 93% believe that election workers should be protected from threats and harassment. So what we see is that actually when we kind of drill down on some of the specifics, if we don't use these amorphous words like democracy, spoken as someone who has democracy in the title of her organization, maybe something we should reconsider. When we talk about specific concepts, people actually have a fair amount of trust and faith in the system. You all know the bad news. I'm not going to belabor it. You wouldn't be here if you didn't know the bad news. But I do just want to highlight one thing when it comes to the states, which is that the election denial movement that Donald Trump has really been the face of now for the last few years is much bigger than him. So we're talking a lot today about the presidency. That's super, super important. But what's equally important is all the people in the local and the county and the statewide positions and in state legislatures and in Congress. In Congress right now, 1/3 of the sitting members are classified by our metric at States United as election deniers. You can go to electiondeniers.org to learn more about specific members and candidates. There are election deniers running up and down the ballot in our states, including for the offices that oversee elections, like Secretary of State. And about 1/3 of the state legislatures in some of our key battleground states also are filled with election deniers who make policy around elections and democracy. So we have to think about this really collectively, globally, across the board. And I'm obviously a big proponent for the statewide and the down ballot, and I think that's where so much of the action is. Okay, let's talk about a couple things that statewide officials like the fabulous A.G. Ellison can do to address this crisis, this moment that we're in. The first is they can do their jobs. They can defend our rights and freedoms. They can defend our strong election laws. They defend our election results. You watched them all go to court in 2020 and defend our votes. They can do other things too, though, that really make a difference for people. So many things, like protecting people from predatory lenders and stopping polluters, right? All the ways in which government delivers for people, which I think is actually the best way to restore people's faith in government, is to show them those real results. And that's what AGs in particular do all day, every day. That's their bread and butter. And they're also, though, beyond their work in court and their work, passing laws and setting budgets and doing the work of making people's lives better, they're also really trusted messengers. What we find in polling is that state and local officials are actually much more trusted, with all due respect for any congressional or national figures in the room. They're very trusted in their states and in their localities. And so using that bully pulpit is a really important thing in this moment. But talking about democracy is tricky. I was with someone yesterday who is extremely well-educated and sophisticated, and I said I was coming here to do this panel on autocracy, and they were like, "What's autocracy?" And I think that's really important for us to remember. When you talk to people about democracy, most people don't think about the peaceful transfer of power, our election systems, the health of our institutions. They think about the following things: inflation, inequality, immigration, abortion rights, the media. Okay, democracy is a really abstract idea. So when you see stories about how more people trust Trump to protect democracy than Biden, that's why. It's because we're not all talking about the same thing. I will say, as I said earlier, if you get more specific, you see some things that are really helpful. There was actually a really interesting one I saw today from Citizen Data from Mindy Finn, which is that when you walk people through the basic, the key parts of Project 2025, 59% of Americans don't like any of it. They're opposed to all of it. Okay, that's a really big deal. And they also have strong feelings when it comes to protecting the freedom to vote, respecting the will of the people, and keeping election workers safe, as I said earlier. So at States United, we help, we test these concepts, we poll around them, and then we help state officials like Keith Ellison go out there and talk to voters and talk to constituents in a way that resonates, in a way that can move the ball forward. And another piece of this, of course, is pushing back on disinformation, which we could talk more about, but that's a totally pervasive problem. Yeah.
Thanks, Joanna. That was really terrific. And I just want you guys to know about Guantanamo. So Sarah and I are rooming together already.
Shoot.
We're rooming together at Gitmo.
Adjoining.
If it's a four-person bunk, we have Jonathan V. Last and Tim Miller. So you guys will have
Does
to
that
work
mean
out.
I'm stuck with
The
Norm?
bulwark gets
You're
its own
stuck.
block.
You're stuck with.
Yeah.
You and Keith and Norm are in the lawyers division. It's really an exciting place. You know, they have a lot of panels scheduled on Chevron and stuff. You know, and we'll be in the better part, frankly. If got time. Shouldn't joke about it, honestly, but whatever. Gotta
else
have a
can
little
you do?
dark humor. A little dark humor never hurt anyone, right? I mean, Sarah Longwell, you do the focus groups. You talk to the voters. You've been involved so much in actually speaking to voters in 2020 and 2022. Tell us what works, what doesn't work, what lessons you have, et cetera.
So let me just tell you quickly how I met Bill. So I, back in 2016, I was just like a normal lesbian Republican, right? Like you meet all the time. And
Totally normal.
yeah, and you know, just doing normal Republican things, like talking about the debt and, you know, other policy things. And then Donald Trump happened. And the first thing I did was, after panicking, the first thing I did was after he won, we started spending a lot of time in rooms of sad Republicans. And it was like, this is why Bill and I already know who we're going to room with, because that room has been pretty consistent of people who like wanted to push back against Trump immediately. And Bill and I had a bunch of bad ideas out of the gate, right? The first one was, we are going to primary Donald Trump. And so I started doing a lot of focus groups to understand how I could primary Trump, because I was pretty sure that Trump was an accident of history, because my Republican Party would never nominate a guy like Donald Trump. And so I started doing focus groups. And because I was running around to like governors and different congressmen, Bill and I were saying, please run for president, please run against Trump. And they were like, well, prove to me that I can win. And so we started doing all this quant and qual. And as we started listening to Republican voters, we said, oh, no, they want this. And we had spent too much time in think tanks in Washington, D.C., and did not understand what was happening to the Republican Party. And if I had to tell you two things that have changed from back then, when part of the reason we didn't understand how to deal with Trump in the beginning is because we didn't understand the voters in the Republican Party, and we didn't understand the Republican Party. And the two things that have really changed are voters now are not just, back then there was like a chunk of people who were super into Trump, and a bunch of other people who were kind of slowly being convinced, right? Slowly the tribalism was working on them. They're all in now. Not everybody, not absolutely everybody, but if you ask anyone what percentage of Republicans think the election was stolen, it's about 70%. If you look at the primaries, Nikki Haley was getting 28%. You know, there is about 70% of the Republican Party that's basically there for the Trump project. The second thing that has changed, and that we didn't know at the time, is that the Republican Party was going to completely fall in line, and that anybody who didn't fall in line was going to get exorcised. And that means that we are now going into a potential second Trump term without Jim Mattis, without Liz Cheney, without, I can't even remember their names from back in, all of them.
Mike Pence.
Mike Pence.
Yeah, Adam Kinzinger.
Anybody that you looked at as a normal Republican, and this is, I remember texting some friends at the time. I was like, hey, I met Bill Kristol, he's really great. Also, don't worry about the Trump thing, because Republicans are responsible people, and they'll keep Trump in line. And that is the thing that I remember being the most wrong about. Because anybody who did that is gone now. They would have no role in a second Trump administration. So all of the things that protected us last time, the voters putting a stop on the Republican, right? People being worried, well, you know, some of these voters won't vote for us if we do this. They don't feel that way anymore. They feel totally emboldened by the voters in the Republican Party because there's been a political realignment. The voters that voted for John McCain and Mitt Romney, a lot of those people now vote for Democrats. They have moved. But a lot of new voters, people who didn't even vote before, Trump changed the electorate and who it is comprised of. He changed the way people think. You know, people always use that expression about the frog in the pot boiling. But that's what's happened to people, right? Every insane thing that's happened, from Access Hollywood to standing on the stage with Vladimir Putin and siding against America's intelligence community, to staging a coup at the White House, has caused people to slowly just become like, yeah, man, things are crazy. And they're not reacting with revulsion, right? They're not, the instincts that used to kick in that would reject something like this, like our antibodies, they're weak now. And so when I think about what we have to do, there's really only one thing we have to do, and that's win the election. Like, Donald Trump can't become president. If we just sat up here, we could lather everybody up with fear about how terrible it's going to be. And so the only option is to not let Donald Trump win. And the way that you do that is essentially by giving Al Pacino's speech from Any Given Sunday, which is like, we're going to have to fight for the 5 inches in front of our face because it is at the margins in every single one of these states that we need to win. But we're in the best position now than we've been. So I talk to voters all the time. I started this whole thing with explaining why I talk to voters constantly, and it was because I didn't see Trump coming. But now I do see all of it coming. I talk to voters all week, every week. I got super addicted to it. I don't work for anybody. I don't work for any campaign. I do it because I want to understand where voters are. And the fact is, the dominant groups that were going to decide this election were what we were calling the double haters. Because they hate Donald Trump, great. They didn't hate Joe Biden, but they thought it was irresponsible to vote for him. They thought he was too old and he could not complete another 4 years. And they didn't want to vote for either person. And so now we're like reborn today. We're reborn. We are reborn with, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but some people, the only thing that's happened since all of this is that everybody's asking me, because they know I do focus groups and I talk to a lot of swing voters, they're like, yeah, but will these swing voters vote for Kamala Harris, right? You're all probably wondering that too. So it is true, voters have a negative impression of Kamala Harris. Their negative impression is informed by this, though. This is what they all say. They say the same thing over and over, group to group, all the time. What does she even do? I don't see her. I don't know anything about her. I was excited about her back in the day, but now I don't even see her. What do I know about her? Okay, that sounds bad, right? And when you see in polls her approval rating being low, okay, that's what it's made up of. It's people being like, but what does she do? Who is she? I don't feel like I know anything about her. That's great news. It's great news. She gets to define herself right now. She gets to pick some Midwestern white dude, which, by the way, my most flaming hot take right now is that everybody's going to call her the DEI president, but I don't know, aren't we all just waiting to check the box of the white, straight Midwestern? Like, isn't that what we have to do, right? Like, Gretchen Whitmer and Pete Buttigieg are obviously the most qualified people to be her vice president, but we can't have 2 women and we can't have a gay guy, so, we need the straight white man. Check that box. Yeah. What was I talking about? Just kidding. Yeah, why we can win. The point is that we have the chance, and Kamala Harris has the chance, and whoever she chooses as her vice president has the chance to go on offense, to define Trump. There are swing voters out there who do not want to vote for Trump. They just need something to be for. And now we have 3.5 months to give them something to be for.
Thank you, Sarah. I enjoyed watching some of the lawyers for the different organizations sponsoring this conference who have been giving us lectures about you have to be C3, 501c3 compliant, having heart attacks. Everyone's speaking as an individual. No one controls what anyone says.
And
Free speech is a great principle of America.
If you need to come up and give a disclaimer, you just at any point.
Yeah.
Our ethics czar is here.
We're so far beyond that.
Yeah, right. That was great, Sarah. Let me ask, I mean, Keith, comment on any of this you want, but let me ask one particular question. I do think in 2020, there were still state and local officials and volunteers as election workers and so forth who were, let's just call it, more traditional Republicans, believed in the rule of law, believed you shouldn't intimidate voters, believed you should count the ballots accurately, believed you should certify them if you were the local Michigan, whatever that board is, remember? Yeah. I mean, how much, and that was true in Minnesota, I assume, and Minnesota actually has quite a tradition of, I'm going to say, responsible Republicans, and to some degree, right? Vin Weber, I used to have friends there.
You still do there, Bill.
Yeah, they're all Democrats, but that's okay. I'm really curious about this, though, because we don't see it much from D.C. What is it like at the county and local and precinct, whatever level? I mean, are you fairly confident in the continued bipartisan ability, because our elections are run in so unlike European countries at the state and local level, to do this, or are you worried that the kind of people you had to beat back in 2020 who want to show up with AR-15s are more dominating even at the local level?
I would say that I'm fairly confident, not overconfident. Some of you may remember Colin Peterson, who was probably the most conservative Democrat in the Democratic caucus. He was the head of the Ag Committee, and he was the only Democrat who could hold that seat. He's now lost that seat. And so, I can tell you that I think there's some folks who have sort of we've got to have, Trump's got to win, and I've got to do whatever I got to do to help him win. So and this is particularly problematic around some Native American communities, and so that's a situation. And here's the other thing: we don't have enough younger people volunteering to be election workers. If you go to the polls in most places, the young people are 65, and so we've really got to do something to really get more folks volunteering, staying there all day, and being part of the apparatus of the election. And so I think that is a real concern. And then the other thing is that just, voter intimidation, it's harder to do in the Twin Cities because there's more media, there's more people there's just more people, more dense population. But in some of those rural communities where, you have, like Brown County, Minnesota has 5,000 people, great county full of wonderful folks, but, just a smaller population, you wonder if a few people going in there acting tough might scare some voters back. And so we're making sure that we're present, we're making sure that we're there, we're making sure that we're going to the rural counties, letting folks know that we do need them to volunteer for nonpartisan, just election protection and participation in the voting apparatus, what the rules are. And I can tell you that we're working with our Secretary of State on a regular basis. That's the other thing. Secretaries of State are particularly important in this moment. And they are the chief election officers. And you cannot pull off an election with just paid staff. You've got to have people who are willing to just go there and be part of that. And so that's really what's going on the ground level.
That's interesting. Say a word also about, both Joanna and Sarah talked about what voters think out there, and you actually are an elected official in a Midwestern state that it's a little Democratic, but it was pretty close in 2020. So what rings true about what Joanna and Sarah said? Anything you want to add about sort of voter sentiments, voter thinking?
Here's the thing. I think it's important for us to just acknowledge that we got here in part because Donald Trump said some things that were true and that nobody else was talking about. Like, hey, I know the system is rigged. I give money to both sides. I've rigged it myself. We've got to do something about campaign finance reform. Because we haven't, we've left the door open. And things like that. We all know that he doesn't care about Social Security, but when he said, I'm the only Republican on this stage who's going to support your Social Security, people are worried about what they're going to do in older age. People are not saving enough. There's a lot of, and so there are problems in our country that neither party was really talking strongly enough about retirement, election integrity and democracy, and these things are still there, folks. We still have got to make people think that their state legislature, their congressperson is their congressperson and not some lobbyist somewhere else in St. Paul or Washington. That problem exists, and that level of cynicism is there. And I can tell you, the electorate is somewhat cynical. People, unless they know you're doing something, they assume you're not doing it. And so you've got to show up, you've got to be present. And I would say that in the more rural parts of our every single state, New York City has you have greater New York. Chicago has all the rest of Illinois. Minnesota has all the rest of Minnesota. Folks who live in these urban communities, if you want to go do something valuable in the election, you've got to go out and talk to your neighbors who live in rural communities. You've got to talk to them in respectful ways, figure out what it means to see your dairy farm be something that you can't sustain anymore, that's been in your family for 3 generations. You've got to look out there and see there used to be independent pharmacists, independent stores, but now it's all Family Dollar, right? And so, one thing that both we can all agree on as progressives and liberals and conservatives and Republicans is that our country doesn't have enough competition. And so what does that mean? That means the small player is being squeezed out all across this country, and people feel it. You go to rural communities in Minnesota and you start criticizing corporate America, people will applaud you. So those are a few thoughts.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, Joanna, around the country, you're in touch with all these people at the state level. How worried are you about intimidation, violence, just actual problem? I think 2020 was so traumatic, and everyone now has studied correctly what happened between November 3rd and January 6th, and some of us were involved in tangentially in some of those fights to prevent the President of the United States from using the instrumentalities of the federal government to stage a coup, which was really dangerous, what he tried to do at DOJ and DOD. I think that part is sort of under the mob attacking the Capitol. Everyone knows about what he tried to do within the government. Even scarier, from my point of view, that won't happen this time. But conversely, as Sarah sort of said, the degree of mobilization on the right, the degree of legitimization of militias and violence and, some rogue law enforcement officers themselves deputizing a whole bunch of other people. So when the Attorney General says, you can't intimidate voters, oh no, we're here as agents of the state making sure there's election integrity. I mean, how worried are you that September, October gets very messy, or do you think this is mostly under control?
Look, the rise in political violence, but more importantly, tolerance of political violence in this country is deeply alarming. I think it's probably why many of us are here today. And also, I know that what A.G. Ellison said is true, which is that we have the most incredible network of state and local officials across the country prepared to run a secure, free, fair election, as they did in 2020, prepared to speak truth about our elections, to use those bully pulpits to communicate to the American public the reality of what's going on. And then, as I said earlier, we do actually have a fundamental faith that we can capitalize on, that people have in the system. You talked about good Republicans. I think part of why I enjoy my work so much is I get to work with good Republicans every day in our battleground states who are in all kinds of different positions to be overseeing the election process and who really demonstrated some of the most incredible instances of bravery and courage, and who've also dealt with threats and harassment and people showing up at their homes and having to send their spouses and children elsewhere, and that's terrifying. And then, of course, there are the issues of voter intimidation and the possibilities for, as you said, Bill, protests and mobilizations. One of the things we do at States United is we train law enforcement leaders on protecting elections and election officials and keeping our infrastructure safe. And it's been really interesting work because I didn't know what to expect when I started out. Because we work with state AGs, many of whom are the chief law enforcement officers in our states, we started in 2020 by doing some work with them around voter intimidation and having them do a lot of messaging about it, that it was illegal, that it wouldn't be tolerated, and that there would be consequences for people if they engaged in it. And we found militia members self-reporting and communicating with their groups that people shouldn't go to the polls on election day because they had seen these announcements. And so over time, we've developed a program where we work with not just state AGs, but also police chiefs and sheriffs and others to be prepared to do this work. And I think a big part of what's happened is that this is not work that law enforcement leaders ever had to do before. It's like if you're the chief of Green Bay, Wisconsin, you're used to protecting football games, but you're not used to having to protect elections and election officials, et cetera. So I actually feel like we are much better prepared this time around than we were 4 years ago. I think we will definitely see, there's definitely a lot that we are concerned about and monitoring, but I think we have a system that really works and that people can believe in, and fundamentally, a lot of leaders across the country, many of whom we don't get to hear from enough, who are here just doing this work every single day.
Well, that's great. That's encouraging. You know, Sarah, I was listening to Keith Ellison and talking about the cynicism and skepticism about elected officials and about Washington, and I think the media would fit into that. You might say a word, if you want, about how you came up with the voter testimonials that characterized Republican voters against Trump and Republicans for the rule of law and many other groups that Sarah has spearheaded, where, well, I'll let you tell the story of why aren't we seeing slick commercials? Why are we seeing these guys speaking into their cell phones and saying whatever they want?
Well, we will see a lot of slick commercials. In fact, everybody's about to get inundated. There are like $500 million worth of advertising over the next few months. But the reason, so when we started, one of the first things Bill and I started was our C4 Defending Democracy Together, a group called Republicans for the Rule of Law, because it was around the time it looked like Trump was going to try to fire Mueller so that he wouldn't get investigated by the special counsel after he had fired Comey. And those were a lot of ads in the early days that like really hit hard on Trump, and they went viral on Twitter. But we would test them with swing voters in the focus groups, and they didn't do anything. The swing voters in the focus groups, or these moderate Republicans, right-leaning independents, were kind of like, yeah, everybody just attacks Trump, and and part of it is that voters no longer trust anything. Like, and honestly, they sit there in the focus group sometimes, and they're like, I don't know who to trust. They're inundated with stuff on social media. The institutions that they used to trust, kind of whether it's the church or, I'm not sure that anybody ever trusted politicians exactly, but like their faith in everything has crumbled, which actually makes people scared, right? It makes people scared and angry. And I think that's all that fear, coupled with a lot of loneliness, is a lot of what you see from people that is motivating these actions. You're going to have to bring me back. I always do this. I like follow myself down a rabbit hole. Okay, so this is why I started doing the testimonials. It's because we saw in the focus groups that people weren't responding to them. And when we figured out, like, okay, who do people trust? The number one group that people trusted was people like me. Not me, Sarah Longwell, though obviously I'm trustworthy, but like people like themselves, right? You are gonna, if you just like hear about a movie and somebody says it's good or somebody says it sucks, you're much more likely to make a decision if your sister tells you, I saw that movie, it sucked, don't bother. And so like what we started to do, and the pandemic actually kind of helped us in this regard, was first thing we had done was we had built a massive list of disaffected Republicans in the early days. And we went to those people and said, hey, will you explain why as a Republican you're not voting for Trump again? And people just started making these little videos and testimonials, and people are terrible. A lot of them are older. They shoot themselves up the nose and down the, from weird angles, and their audio and their video, and the quality's pretty bad. But guess what? Just like people trusted Trump because they thought he was authentic, people are moved by the testimonials because they seem authentic. People feel like, oh, this is a person who is in my tribe. There's a reason we call it Republican voters against Trump and not Republican voters for Biden. And it's because they are not Biden voters, right? The biggest coalition in politics is an anti-Trump coalition, not necessarily a pro-Democrat coalition. And you had to harness those people, and that is what we did to move people from a persuasion standpoint. We were the biggest outside spenders against Carrie Lake in 2022. In 2020, like the real voices, the authentic voices, it just has much more persuasion value than the slick ads. And we're doing it again in 2024, and we are right now refilming hundreds and hundreds of them. because they were all ready to say, yeah, fine. And it's just funny.
man.
You know what? The ones that actually move people the most, that are the most persuasive, are the ones where it's like somebody being like, I can't believe I have to vote for Joe Biden. Because nobody, it's not like authentic for a Republican to be jumping up and down talking about how they're going to vote for Joe Biden. It's them saying, I absolutely cannot vote for Trump, so fine, I'll do it on Biden. But now we've got to go back to all those people and be like, so, Kamala. And my team is working hard on that right now.
I mean, it really was striking. I once ran in 2020 as these ads were going, we were up on TV, some, but a huge amount of digital media and just circulation, grassroots and organically. Someone said, I like your ads are great. Sarah's doing a great job with those, but couldn't you, I mean, some of those people criticize Joe Biden, actually, or say they don't like the Democrats on certain issues. And A, they're saying what they believe. We don't edit them much, except, with the margin just to make them the right times, make sure they're short enough and so forth. But B, that's why they're authentic, And of course, the Biden campaign is not, let's say the Harris campaign now, is not going to put out an ad that has a word critical of Kamala Harris, right? I mean, she was the greatest attorney general ever. She was the greatest senator ever. She's the greatest vice president ever. She's right, which is fine. That's what campaigns are about, obviously. But there is some, this is sort of what Keith was saying too about politics. There's a credibility when someone goes, I'm pro-life. I've been pro-life my whole life, and it's hard for me to cross the aisle to vote. This was 2020. For Joe Biden, or in 2022 for the Democratic gubernatorial candidates in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Arizona. But I just can't vote for someone who threatens our democracy, and I'm just going to have to, do it this once. I don't consider myself a Democrat, or I don't love the Democrats. I mean, the stuff that they said that the official Democratic Party and Democratic candidates in Biden campaign didn't like was actually what made the ads effective. Among a certain sliver of the audience. Now, wouldn't be effective for everyone, perhaps, but it did speak to those people. And I think there's a real lesson there, though, in terms of what Keith said earlier about speaking to people we don't agree with and sort of terms they understand. Too much of the political talk is just so over the top, hortatory,
Right.
and that it just has no credibility, I think.
Bill, can I ask Sarah a question?
Yeah, please.
So Sarah, you're doing this project in terms of candidate A, candidate B, and a presidential. Is this a doable thing? Do you think it would be effective if we just sort of made the candidate rule of law, respecting the outcome of elections? Just sort of some of the things that, that we were just talking about just a moment ago, so that we can have a longer-term restoration of shared consensus democratic values, as opposed to just November.
Yeah.
You understand what I mean?
I do, and it's actually a great point, a great question. So going into November, you've got to draw a contrast. We're in the contrast business. In 2022, we did the same thing, mainly with governors and secretaries of state going after election deniers. So it was a bunch of Republican voters making exactly this case, that they couldn't vote for somebody who had told the lie about the election. However, going forward, and it goes back to my early things with Bill. When we thought if we just beat Trump, like the muscle memory of the Republican Party would come back. And we're wrong about that, right? The party has fundamentally changed. And in fact, when people say to me, they're like, well, how are we going to get back to a Mitt Romney party? And I won't be like, it's not coming back. It'll save everybody time if they just understand that it's not coming back. What we have to do, ultimately, I think, and this might be slightly different, from what you would do. I think that because we understand this is a long-term fight, it is not short-term. The future of the Republican Party is some weird combination of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and J.D. Vance, right? That is where it is headed. And so you have to deliver sustained electoral defeats against those people in order to create incentives for it to change, number one. Number two, I believe you have to rebuild the center of this country. So, I don't know what people's political persuasions are here, but I am still more center, right center. And I think that there is a world in which, and frankly, the Democratic Party, in response to Trump, has put up a bunch of pragmatic politicians that these center-right voters can vote for. Abigail Spanberger, Alyssa Slotkin, Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, all these white guys they're talking about as VP candidates, Bashir. The Democratic Party's actually built a pretty moderate bench, but one of the things that's happened, a lot of people talk about structural reform, they talk about democracy reform. You may be in a lot of rooms where people talk about ranked choice voting and everything else. Those are changes to systems. They are not changes to people. We are not persuading anybody, and we are going to have to build an appetite, again, for moderation, and even not just moderation, pragmatism, working for people, and let me tell you this one, compromise. This is gonna sound really obvious, but I'll tell you, when you talk to voters now, and this is to me actually the most fundamental problem, voters will want things. They will want policies. They will want things done on healthcare. They will want things done on debt. They will want things done on immigration. But they do not want their politicians to compromise to get there. And as soon as voters lose the understanding that compromise is the mechanism to a policy outcome, they reach for strongmen. They reach for strongmen because they don't, it used to be a part of a value set. You'd hear voters say it all the time. Well, I want someone who reaches across the aisle. You'd hear politicians say that they reach across the aisle because it was important for voters to feel that they were that kind of person. But voters now say, no, don't compromise. Compromise is a dirty word. You work with the uniparty. You work with Democrats, especially on the Republican side. Actually, you still hear a lot of Dems say that they can work with Republicans. You do not hear that going the other way because their voters don't want it. And that is a thing we have got to rebuild in this country if we're going to have a healthier politics.
Well said. Time for just a couple of questions. Don't want to intrude on the next panel, but I don't. Can I recognize someone? Sir, yeah.
It's a little hard because it's a little hard because it's a mixed group, but
It's okay.
you talked about you talked a little bit about sort of this need to sort of compromise and the need to sort of come to the middle, and I don't know. To me, as a 56-year-old black gay man who grew up in the 70s and 80s, who saw Gerald Ford say New York dropped dead, who later found out that Nixon said you want to get the blacks, you go after the drugs, who saw Ronald Reagan just destroy the gay male population by ignoring the threat of HIV/AIDS, and on and on and on. I don't see this modern Republican Party as being that fundamentally different. I see Donald Trump as being the person who shouted through a bullhorn all the stuff that the Republican Party had been dog whispering and whispering behind closed doors for the entirety of my life, but we Democrats found out about it and talked about it. And I see that a lot, and so I want if we are ever going to come to something like that, to some sort of rapprochement, of coming together, there's going to have to be some honesty from you traditional Republicans. Because I see you all, and not just the two of you, I'm talking about the earlier panels today, et cetera, acting as though, oh, this Trump thing, it just came out of nowhere. I never saw it. And I'm sorry, to me, as a gay black man, the Republican Party has been the party of white supremacy for the entirety of my life. That is how I have looked at it. That is what I have seen through its policies. That is what I've seen through things that people say. It has been the party of homophobia. It has been the party of AIDS denial and so many other issues that matter to me. And when you all sort of act as though Trump was just this sort of weird outlier and we don't know where he came from, it undercuts the ability to actually create some sort of truth and justice and reconciliation beyond this election. And so I'd like to hear more of you guys sort of owning that reality.
No.
You want to go first?
Yeah. So I'm not going to own it, and I'll tell you why. Because here's the world that I grew up in, so I'm a little younger than you. And when I was, 2013 or 2012 when I got engaged, Barack Obama didn't believe in gay marriage. He ran for president in 2008, and he didn't support gay marriage. He, in his second term, finally came around. So I grew up in a political party, and I grew up under Bill Clinton, where I watched him, we're post-Me Too now. I saw him sleep with his intern, lie about it to the American people, and then I saw the feminist movement come to his defense. And so for an 18-year-old, I was like, what is this scumbag person doing, and why are these people defending him? So we all grow up in our political realities. And the thing, and I grew up in central Pennsylvania, in a very small town, and I'm not, with conservative parents for sure, but I'm just saying, like, we all saw things that informed our worldviews. I also grew up, and then I sort of went into Republican politics, and I saw some good things, and I saw some bad things that started to make me, when I was just out of college, my first job was working for Christine O'Donnell. Do you guys remember her? She was not a witch, yeah? And she got fired, not for being a witch, just because she was weird. And I got her job, and I had to go work for Rick Santorum.
Oh. You're complaining about Barack Obama?
Huh? Well, but this is, yeah, right? I understand. No, actually, people would come up to Rick Santorum and they would glitter bomb him. Do you remember when that was a thing? And there was a kid there. There was always gay protesters, and I wasn't out to my parents yet. But I was standing, I remember I was standing next to these two gay moms, and then their kid was there with a protest sign that said, "My two moms take me bowling." And I was like, I quit. I quit this job. And Trump was like that for me. But there was a bunch of things in the intervening time that I believed in deeply. I believed that we were so far in debt as a country that we weren't going to be able, and that is still an existential problem facing our country that Democrats don't want to grapple with. Immigration, do you know why Trump is winning? Hold on, sir. Do you know why Trump is winning? Because Democrats just won't talk about immigration. They won't do a thing about it. And the Republicans that I grew up with, were much more pro-immigration, right? If you go back and look at Reagan, the party that I grew up under was very pro-immigrant, very pro-immigration. Trump changed on that. So I'm just saying that we all see things that inform us and make us who we are, what makes us think that the other side is bad. And then there are moments of clarity, right, where I think that Trump is anathema to the Republican Party. He does not believe in limited government. He doesn't believe in free markets. He doesn't believe in American leadership in the world. Those are three things that I believe in that made me a young conservative. Character was another one that the Republican Party believed in when I was coming up, and they contrasted themselves with Bill Clinton. It's a big part of why I became a conservative at the time, at that age. Okay? And for me, Trump was a real departure. So I'm just saying the things that we both saw that created our worldview, I don't think that we have to sit around now and tell each other to own everything that everybody did from our political party before. I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's useful. I don't think it moves us forward.
Let me jump in
Can I
here.
just?
So let me just say this. I feel you. I feel you. But here's the other thing. George W. Bush pushed through PEPFAR, which turned a death sentence into a chronic illness, AIDS in Africa. I'm sorry, it happened. It's true. In Minnesota, when the Voting Rights Act went through in 1965, every single Democrat and Republican voted for it. It wasn't until the 60s, later 60s, until, the Republicans stopped. It felt like, civil rights was not something that, it was a generally shared thing. But then, you had, Jack Kemp and others who seemed like they did care about ordinary people. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is I feel what you're saying, and after we deal with this issue, what we need to come together in is on what we already come together on: rule of law, independent judiciary, freedom of the press, and then we're going to go back arguing over stuff. But that's all right, because that's democracy. The clash of ideas is the sound of freedom. And so we will never really all be singing Kumbaya in America, but we'll be doing it, and then the election's over, and then whoever loses says, well, we're gonna go back and get them next time, y'all. And that's just gonna be, I think, how it is. It's too much to expect that we're going to own things, right? And I'll just say, Democrats and Republicans have not dealt with a lot of really critical things, like the fact that we have seen markets concentrate over the last 30 years, and neither Democrats or Republicans have taken antitrust particularly seriously. And it has created a lot of problems in rural America and urban America too. And who's really dealing with the fact that you got all these people who are getting to be 65, 70, ain't got no money? I mean, are we really dealing with these things that are going? And let me just say this: I'm married to a Colombian, proud of it. I'm very close to immigrant communities, but it's not true that large numbers of people who immigrate without authorization don't have downward wage pressure. They do. That's a fact. Why don't we admit it? Why don't we say, you big businesses that are making money off of lower wage workers have got to do something to deal with displaced workers in America? What if we did that? We've got to find a way to get into a conversation. We're not in one right now. We're yelling back and forth. But there's got to be some ways to get to compromise. That's all I want to say about that.
I think our time is, thank you for that actually interesting and provocative question. I'll take 1 minute and we'll end. I would just say this, I have rethought some things, and I think many, actually, to be fair, a lot of the Never Trump Republicans at least have written, some of them have written whole books, Stuart Stevens and Charlie Sykes, about what they think they were wrong about or what they think they exaggerated or misunderstood at the time, and I think all of us should go through that process of rethinking. I mean, I get criticized for that a lot by former friends and giving talks, and you once said this, why don't you still say this? I say, you know what, you change your mind occasionally in life. It'd be kind of terrible if everything you believed at age 70 is stuff you believed at age 30, right? It wouldn't show great intellectual development over 4 decades. So I think that's fine. I think it's wise to say what you suggest, and there's more truth probably than a lot of conservatives want to admit, is that there were elements that went in a certain direction. I'm not sure they had to, and there were decent elements also, and admirable elements, I would say. Some problems on the other side. But I do think, what's that Churchill line in 1940 or something, when his own allies wanted to relitigate Chamberlain's mistakes, and Chamberlain was part of the Churchill government until he died quite soon after Churchill became prime minister. And if we I can't remember the quote, so but if we relitigate history now, we will lose the future. And I'm totally open. I'm myself am interested in intellectual history and political history. We should all thoroughly explore these things. I think it's totally fair, and I've learned a lot from actually some pretty left-wing historians writing about Reagan and so forth. But I do think in the short, medium term, winning the future is the task. And I think our time is up, so thank you all very much, and thank this panel very much.
What do you say if we relitigate the past? We'll miss the future? We'll lose the future.
Yeah, we relitigate.